Do?
Yes, to print the blueprints. See Mark at the Personal Service Center. He can print blueprints, notarize permit applications, print and mail out invoices, and even provide great-looking business cards.
Personal Service Center. That's the one on the corner of Northeast 25th Avenue and 24th Street, right?
Just look for the yellow signs. Your Pedigree Palace will be a reality in no time.
Ocala's information station, 1370 WOCA.
Ocala.
All right, 25 minutes before 10 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. One of the things that resonates with me is when you hear the statement that what is the worst thing that can happen to humanity? I'm not good at paraphrasing things, but the worst thing that can happen to humanity is when good people do nothing in the face of bad things that are going on. And that's why it's so important to remember the bad things that have happened. It's hard to imagine that while, I like to believe, Anne Frank kind of, in her diary, she let us all realize that, one candle can light a whole room. Remember that line?
Yes.
And that, as bad as it might be, most people are good and all that. You want to believe that, but it still doesn't take. But it just takes one person who can convince the masses that there's reason to commit genocide on a whole group of people. And in the course of human history, we've seen it many, many, many times. And don't call me and chastise me for pretending I'm guilty and doing that whole guilt thing on me. I am not there. But guess what? You know what? In a way, we all have been guilty of one thing or another. When you hear surviving stories, then you realize that we have to fight to make sure this kind of stuff never happens again, stuff like the Holocaust. Dr. Tammy Bottner is on the phone. She has written a book called Among the Reeds. It's the true story of how a family survived the Holocaust. Dr. Bottner is a physician. She treats children and adolescents. She is the child and grandchild of Holocaust survivors. Talented photographer, and I have the cover of the book Among the Reeds on the streaming podcast that we're doing. I just messed up. That's why I was a little bit flustered in the beginning, but it looks like it's working now. So, Dr. Tammy Bottner, good morning, doctor. How are you?
Good morning. Good, thank you. How are you?
I'm okay. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from North Shore of Massachusetts.
Oh, I bet it's beautiful up there.
So did you hear?
It is. The leaves are a little late this season, but they'll be turning very soon.
Oh.
Tell me when you first, how old were you when you first heard about your parents' and your grandparents' history regarding the Holocaust?
It was always something I was aware of vaguely. My family didn't talk about it all that much when I was a little kid to me, but I would hear the grown-ups talking after I went to bed, especially when we went to visit my grandparents, and my dad and my grandparents would be talking. And, I don't recall exactly what I heard. I just remember this feeling of anxiety and sort of almost like guilt, like being aware of how difficult things had been for them and how horrible things had been for them, and knowing that I was lucky.
Wow. Really?
It was always there. It's very, very intense.
As a child, you felt the guilt, huh? Wow.
I did, and I didn't articulate it. I wasn't even conscious of it, I think, but looking back at it, I have a sense of how I was feeling.
What would they say to you if you said, I felt guilt? Would they say, so you got guilt? We had to go through... I'm trying to do my best Jewish accent right there. Yeah, what would they say to you? They would probably say, so you got some guilt. That's nothing.
No, I think after World War II, people were so traumatized that they for many years didn't talk about it at all, and they really wanted to protect their children and not bring that in. But as they got older, they started talking more. And so they would wait until the kids had gone to bed to talk about it. But of course, kids know what's going on in the house, and we heard it.
So, as we follow this story, it's just another reminder of how bad people can be to other people. And when you have in those years, there were a few places you could go where people were being treated well. One of them was here. God forbid we ever have that situation happen where there are no places of refuge. That would be horrible. That would be. I don't know what we would do as people. I guess.
Well,
we need to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah. Well, that's particularly timely with what's going on in the world right now. You're right. The U.S. was sort of a refuge, but not really, because there were very strict quotas, and European refugees who were trying to escape really weren't allowed into the U.S. They weren't really allowed anywhere, and that was why
early on, right?
That's why the genocide happened, because people had nowhere to go.
And when your dad was put into convents and moved around with different people, he must have, he was so young, he didn't really understand what was happening, that this was for the best for him to survive.
Absolutely right. So, in a nutshell, my grandmother gave birth to my dad in April of 1940 in Belgium. She was only 18 years old, and that was 3 weeks before the Nazis invaded Belgium.
Oh, my
family had escaped to Belgium as a refuge, but 3 weeks after having a baby, she found herself with my grandfather, in an occupied country. Fast forward 2 years, Jews were being picked up. They were being rounded up on the streets. Factories and workplaces were being invaded, and Jews were being pulled out and thrown onto trucks and sent away. In that setting, my grandparents made the unthinkable decision to give up their children, to send their kids away alone, and send them into hiding in an attempt to save their lives. And so my dad was only 2 years old when he was picked up by a wonderful woman who we can talk about later, who worked for the resistance, and she brought him to a convent where nuns were hiding some Jewish children, and my dad spent the next 2.5 years estranged from his family, unable to speak the language which people spoke was French. He didn't know French, lived in a world of sensory deprivation and loneliness for 2.5 years, which is so unbelievable when you think about a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old and how ill-equipped they are for that sort of trauma.
Did you witness throughout your life your parents or your grandparents having any feelings against Germans in general, or were they able to surpass that?
Yeah. It's a really good question. My grandmother had grown up in Germany and spoke German and really identified with the German culture, and later in life would go back to Germany to vacation. My grandfather, who was originally from Poland, as he got older and he sort of slipped into dementia, he became really, really hyper-focused on what the Nazis had done to his family. His side of the family, which remained in the Ukraine and Poland, really was almost completely wiped out. And so as he got older, he really had an increasingly difficult time. It was almost like he was still back in those days, He was losing his short-term memory, and he became really, really focused on what the tragedy, the horror that had happened. His parents were killed, and his brothers were killed, and his cousins and his friends.
How is it possible that we as humans can participate in something that is the belief of a madman? I don't understand how we have done that, and it's throughout history. There were other examples as well, but it's just, especially in an era, and in the 40s we were there. We were in an era where communication was not so stifled. We had radio. It's just how is it possible that anybody said this is right?
It really defies comprehension. The idea of genocide defies comprehension for most of us. But there is a study that I want to mention that I touch upon in my book. That's really, it's extremely disturbing. In the early 1970s, a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo was working out of Stanford University, and he did this study where he took college students, divided them into two groups, and one of the groups was assigned to be prison guards, and the other group were assigned to be prisoners. And he gave the guards absolute control over the prisoners. These were just college kids who knew each other and were, colleagues. And within a few days, the group that was assigned to be guards became sadistic and brutal to the group of prisoners, and the prisoners became docile and subjugated themselves and accepted the abuse that the other group was giving to them. That's an incredibly disturbing study. It was actually terminated early because eventually somebody realized it was incredibly abusive to do this study.
Yeah, wow.
Sure.
But it shows you that, this is so difficult for us to think about, but we are really complicated, and we harbor extreme potential for good, but we also perhaps harbor some really dark stuff that we don't like to think about.
Every once in a while we'll hear a story of a young child who seems to be talking to a spirit, and I'm not trying to get creepy or weird on you, but there was part of the book that you yourself, when you're an adult now, you give birth to your son, I think it was?
Eerie.
Oh, I gave birth to my son 20 years ago. I'm very much an adult, yeah.
And
He's even an adult.
No, but I mean, when we say, okay, maybe I miss. See, sometimes I'm just all over the map. Okay, a child will. Sometimes you're with a child, they're 2 years old, and they're talking to somebody, and who are you talking to? I'm talking to grandma. Grandma's been dead a year or whatever.
Yeah.
So you say, oh wow, that was kind of creepy. Okay, but in your case, when your son was born, or did I read it wrong? Were you not having flashbacks, like memories of the Holocaust?
Yeah. It was the weirdest thing I've ever experienced. I gave birth. I had a healthy baby. Everything was good. I was very conscious of how fortunate I was. I had no significant issues. And as I brought my son home, I felt like I was experiencing what my grandmother experienced when she brought her child home.
Wow.
However many, 50, 60 years earlier. And what I had these really profound fears. It was almost like in real time, where I thought, what would happen if Nazi boots were pounding up the stairs? What if I was being hunted?
Gosh, yeah.
What if my child was taken from me? What would I do to save him? It was very, very, very intense. And it's complicated. Why did I have those thoughts or those feelings or those? It almost felt like flashbacks. Honestly, it was that intense.
But you knew the stories at that point in your life, right?
Oh, I knew the story very well at that point. What I didn't know, which I've learned in more recent years, is about epigenetics, which is that the children of Holocaust survivors, the children of other survivors who have gone through major trauma, actually inherit a different set of genes that predispose them to having some altered hormones and altered stress hormones and anxiety. So, there is probably a complicated genetic component to this. I'm not saying I inherited my grandmother's memories per se. I don't think it's nearly that simple. But, there was something that I inherited, I think, that made me resonate with that particular story much more strongly, perhaps, than someone who hadn't had ancestors go through it.
Faith plays a very important role in a lot of people's lives over, since the beginning of time. Sometimes people ask the question that when Hitler came into power and he was doing this horrendous things to the Jewish people, they really cling to their faith. They could have pretended to be another faith or another nationality, but they didn't. They stayed true to who they were.
Well, I think to a great extent that's true. Hitler was so twisted that he didn't really care whether anyone stuck to their faith or gave it up. You couldn't unbecome Jewish in his world. You couldn't say, okay, I'll be Christian and I'll be fine. He had these very specific, crazy percentages of how much, quote, Jewish blood was allowed. And if you had, I think it was one Jewish grandparent, you were considered Jewish. It didn't matter whether you never thought of yourself as a Jew or not. You know, that you would be on his list of condemned. I mean, it was so crazy. You know, it's so hard for us to even wrap our heads around this.
Right,
I mean, the degree of hate and the fanaticism of it is it's incomprehensible.
I mean, I can't imagine like being drafted into the German army in those years and saying, "What does he want us?" I mean, I would be the guy who says, "What does he want us to do?" What?
That's really, I know, I've thought about that a lot too, you know, and that was even planned in a very sinister way because, of course, Hitler came to power in 1933. So, and he started the Hitler Youth Movement. You know, he basically took kids and started brainwashing them for almost a decade before the war started. So these were not just normal kids who were drafted into the army. They had been indoctrinated for their entire childhood.
Just like ISIS does.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, you can indoctrinate people with all kinds of ideas, and kids tend to believe what they're told for the most part.
Can you talk?
Luckily, I will say that there were people who stood up, and there were people who helped. Unfortunately, not enough, but there were some incredibly brave people. There were resistance fighters, and there were people who, for example, saved my dad and my aunt. You know, they were hidden by non-Jews who risked their lives to save them.
So the Jewish people have been scattered across the globe for a couple of thousand years, and you have part of the book where it talks about the date, November 29th, 1947, when it was announced by radio that a Jewish state was going to be formed.
Yeah.
Suddenly, a country that we all read about in the Bible is now going to be in existence again, and suddenly the Jewish people have a place to call their own country again, in spite of the fact that maybe you already called the United States or Germany or whatever country was your country. Now you have a Jewish country.
Homeland.
Tell me about that experience, the stories that you heard, obviously, regarding that.
So, you know, even before World War II, and even around World War I, around the turn of the century, there was this movement in Europe, because, of course, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and there were a lot of hate crimes that were going on throughout the centuries. And there was a movement that was started in the early 1900s, the Zionist movement. And that word is like a bad word now. I mean, it shouldn't be a bad word. It's a good word. It means that, you know, the Jews were looking for a place of refuge to call their homeland. So that was already out there in the world. And in the wake of World War II, of course, after 2/3 of the European Jewish population had been wiped out, that movement, for the first time, gained some international momentum. It's almost incomprehensible, I think, for us to realize how momentous of an occasion that was. If you think about what happened during World War II, during the Holocaust, literally 6 million Jews, a quarter of them children, were systematically murdered because they had nowhere else to go. They had no place that would take them in. And to think that would be reversed with the idea of creating this state, this country that was open always to any Jews who needed it. That's an amazing thing that came out of the ashes.
Do you know, I don't know, again, I'm probably out of my territory by talking anything like this, but who's Billy Graham's son? Is it
Franklin?
Franklin Graham?
Yeah.
There was a thing on the news this morning. I think he was basically making commentary on the shootings in Vegas and about what's going on in the world. He says basically what all this is people who just hate God. And I've often wondered, why did the Jewish people have so many people hating them? And maybe it's because of the hate of God. I mean, the Jewish people have always been the people we turn to. They say, "Well, what did God actually say? You had the book, right?" And so I wonder if maybe that was because it doesn't make any sense. Why would there be anti-Semitic attitudes at all unless it's for that reason?
You know, it's amazing. I just came back from a trip to Europe with my husband, and we went to Venice. And in Venice was the original ghetto. So in the 1600s, the Venetians allowed the Jewish community to live there, but they decided they couldn't be allowed to live with the rest of the people, and they created this neighborhood. It was near a foundry, and the Italian word for foundry is ghetto, and that's how the word came about. And they would literally lock up the doors. They closed the bridges and locked the doors, and the Jewish community was not allowed to leave after sunset. Isn't that unbelievable?
How is
It is.
How is it that people allow that kind of stuff to happen?
So here's my theory. I thought about this a lot in Europe. The Catholic Church, the church was so powerful during hundreds of years of European history, and I think the fact that the Jews didn't follow the Catholic Church, I think that was part of it. I think that we don't realize now how pervasive the church was. It controlled every aspect of people's lives.
Maybe.
So anyone who wasn't following that was considered dangerous.
Do you know we're not completely innocent either? And again, don't call me and say you're playing the guilt game. I'm not. This is just history. In New York, everybody knows Wall Street, right? Do you know what Wall Street is named after? It's named after a wall. Do you know what that wall was put up for? It was to keep the Native Americans out of the lower part of Manhattan, which is being populated at that time by the colonial people.
I did not know that.
The Europeans.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah, so I mean, in a way, we were doing the exact same thing to them.
Yeah.
We were in the process of committing genocide on the indigenous peoples
Yes.
of this land, and keeping
Yes.
them out and saying, "Don't come in. We got a wall up. We don't want you to come in."
Well, another wall. We have another wall going up.
And that wall, the remnants of that wall are still there. You can see them. You have to look.
You know, and so I think that that's such a good point, because as soon as we think of another group of people as other, as foreign, as not like us, as less than us, as inhuman, that's when crimes against humanity can happen. Because if you look at someone and you see some commonality with them, if you think, oh, you know, that's a mom like I am, she loves her children, she's, you know, doing whatever,
right.
then you could never like harm them. But as soon as you can categorize them or compartmentalize them into a different category, they're not like me,
Right.
then you don't care about them anymore. And that's what we have to guard against. That's the scary thing.
Dr. Bottner, that's why I have hopes that all of this technology now with Facebook and Twitter and all that, I'm hoping that it's a good thing, because the kids here in America can communicate instantly with a kid over in Iran or in Afghanistan and say, oh, you know what? The kids over there are just like the kids here. It's the leaders that we have to say, get off my planet. You know, the leaders are the ones hurting us all.
Point. I have an 18 and a 20-year-old, and I do see a lot of how they live, and I do think that they are more open-minded than perhaps previous generations. I certainly hope so.
And what are your children's perspectives? Did they read the book? Did they share their feelings with you?
They did read the book. Each of them read the book. They are amazed that they are around. I think they realize that if it hadn't been for my grandparents' actions and my dad's survival, I wouldn't be here, and they wouldn't be here.
I really think books like yours are important, and the reason I think that is because that fact that there's a book, another book, is another
Emotional.
Anne Frank, another opportunity for us to realize, holy cow, we cannot let this happen again.
There, but for the grace of God, you have to think about it, and especially as politically, I think now charged the country is, and it's so important to remember people are people. It doesn't matter where they're from, what their religion is, what their color is,
That's
what their
exactly
nationality
right.
is. Like,
That's exactly
people
right.
are essentially all the same.
And we can't live in a world of fear. I mean, I know
Exactly.
that the events that happened this past week, and that's still going on. We just can't live in fear, or else this is going to happen again.
Yeah, that's right.
And we can't blame a group. We can't name a group, because there is nobody to name. You have to name
We're all the same.
You have to name the individuals that are the problem people, and not the groups that might belong to.
There will always be some crazy people. Unfortunately, there will be some bad people out there, but what we have to do is realize that the majority of people are good and band together and not start pointing fingers, because that leads to bad things.
Tammy, we are out of time. Dr. Tammy Bottner, thank you for taking time. The book is called Among the Reads. Go to Amazon. That's where I found it. It's got 55 customer reviews. It's a 5-star rated book. And I have a copy here if you want the one that was sent to me. I will be glad to give it to you. Before we say goodbye, do you have a website of your own you want to?
I do.
Go ahead.
Yes, so it's TammyBottner.com. And I would love people to check out the book and shoot me a message if you have any thoughts.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
You too. We will be right back.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.